صلوا على محمد وآل محمد. We'll inshallah be beginning the program with some verses from the Holy Quran. Please welcome Malak with the salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم أفلم ينظروا إلى السماء فوقهم كيف بنيناها وزيناها وما لها من فروج والأرض مددناها والكيفنا فيها رواسي وأنبتنا فيها من كل زوج بهيج تبصيرة وذكرى لكل عبد منيب ونزلنا من السماء ماء مباركا فأنبتنا به جنات وحب الحصيد ونخلا باسقات لها طلع نضيد رزقا للعباد وأحيينا به بلدة ميتا كذلك الخروج.
We are very fortunate today to be joined by Rachel Shabi talking about her book, Off-White, The Truth About Antisemitism. Please welcome her with a loud round of applause. Rachel Shabi will be discussing how antisemitism became a battleground. She was born in Israel to Iraqi Jewish parents and grew up in the UK, and she studied politics, literature at the University of Edinburgh. She is now a journalist in the UK, having also reported from the Middle East, including on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and from Tunisia and Egypt. As well as focusing on the Middle East, she writes on issues such as progressive politics, the far right, counter-extremism, and migration. She is also the author of 2 books, including the one she is discussing today, and regularly appears as a commentator on international news challenge. Please give her another round of applause.
Thank you. Assalamu alaikum. Thank you so much for inviting me to be with you all here this evening. I'm just going to read a few extracts from this book, and then hopefully we can have a conversation between us. So I'm going to read a bit from the introduction, which just sets up what the book is about and what it's for. And then there's another bit sort of around about the middle that looks at the myth-making of a Judeo-Christian heritage, what that means, the way it's used in our politics, and in particular by the far right. Okay, so this is from the introduction. In early December 2023, a video about anti-Semitism went viral. Reflexively, I braced, and sure enough, it delivered everything I'd come to expect. The politicized, polarized messiness, the bad faith contortions and confusions, the dumbed-down, meaning-stripped binaries. In short, all the fuel needed to ignite the sprawling online dumpster fire, also known as the modern debate about anti-Semitism. The short clip came from a US House Committee on Education and the Workforce hearing entitled "Holding Campus Leaders Accountable and Confronting Anti-Semitism." The hearing took place amid alarm over anti-Semitism at American universities, including cases of Jewish students being harassed and attacked on campuses. It occurred in the context of a wider global spate of anti-Semitism. A Jewish woman stabbed in France, shootings at Jewish day schools in Canada, desecrations of Jewish buildings with hate-filled graffiti and swastikas across Europe, and a full-blown anti-Semitic riot in Russia's Dagestan. Countries everywhere reported the greatest escalation of anti-Semitism in modern times. But in early December, at the House Committee hearing, the presidents of three of America's leading universities, Harvard, the University of Pennsylvania, and the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, were each asked variations of an apparently simple question. Does calling for the genocide of Jews violate university rules or codes of conduct? Yes or no? Astoundingly, none of them answered with a categoric yes. Instead, they resorted to evasive legalese, hesitant gestures towards context, and seemingly dispassionate distinctions. It was horrible to watch. It seemed to confirm that Jews could not count on anyone to even recognize anti-Semitism, let alone condemn it, and at a time when anti-Jewish hatred was spiraling. And so, as is the way with social media firestorms, we were all drafted into taking sides, and the news headlines played out the debate day after day. In the end, 2 of the 3 testifying university heads resigned. But all too predictably, a 3-minute clip did not accurately represent the proceedings of a hearing that lasted over 5 hours. It reflected mostly that a trap had been set by New York Republican Congresswoman Elise Stefanik in asking that particular question, and that the 3 university presidents walked right into it. Stefanik had prepared the ambush by suggesting that chants of intifada, Arabic for uprising, at Palestine solidarity marches were equivalent to calls for genocide. Intifada is a long-used and common slogan in Palestine solidarity actions, including in demonstrations across American campuses. Those university heads botched a basic moral question that shouldn't require more than 1 second of thought. And yet, across those hours of the hearing, we could also see the 3 thinking seriously about how to safeguard Jewish students and other minorities, including Muslims, also facing renewed threats, while protecting free speech on campus. We learned that action had been taken, that they wanted to enable students to communicate constructively across differences and saw education as a key tool. Far from dispassionate on the subject, these leaders came across as caring deeply about their responsibilities to their students. Claudine Gay, the former Harvard president who resigned following attacks, including racist abuse that dragged on for weeks, spoke during the hearing on why anti-Semitism had flared at universities. One of the things that has been laid bare over the last couple of months, she said, is how ill-equipped the community has been to deal with dialogue in moments of crisis. And instead, what is substituted for that is the social mediaification of dialogue. It's intemperate, it's ahistorical, it's mean, and it's a way of engaging that has been deeply socialized through social media and is reflexive for a lot of the students on our campus. She might as well have been talking about all of us. She might as well have pointed out that this is how the entire debate around anti-Semitism has been taking place, and for far too long, because that clip and the way it burned through the political ecosystem is typical of what we get wrong when we talk about anti-Semitism. It was a rerun of many similar controversies. It contained the hallmark features that have turned this issue into a convoluted pile-up, like a epic movie car crash, a snarled-up chaos of fire and smoke and spinning wheels and sprawling debris. It revealed how anti-Semitism has become a gotcha moment, a stick with which the right clobbers the left. It showed how claims of anti-Semitism are cynically invoked to silence pro-Palestinian voices and then attached to a broader culture war that strikes out against anti-racism, wokeness, critical race theory, diversity, equity, and inclusion programs, which we've been hearing a lot about in the last few days, or just a generalized liberal elite. It showed the supposedly progressive side tumbling into the trap set by the right, while often lacking the ability to recognize actual anti-Semitism. Many on the left could not see why the testimonies given by those university heads had been so hurtful and alarming, and instead praised them for standing up for free speech in the face of enormous pressure. So yet again, there was this wearing tendency to downplay anti-Semitism, to force it into competition with other axes of oppression, instead of building a tent that could hold us all in it together. So that's just a section from the introduction that lays out what this book is trying to do, which is untangle this convoluted mess that defines so much of the conversation we've been having, or rather that the mainstream political conversation has been. And then further on in the book, I just want to read a few pages dealing with the myth-making that has happened around this so-called Judeo-Christian heritage and what that's all about. So, and this starts with Trump. This is Trump version 1. In 2017, then US President Donald Trump pronounced, "We are stopping cold the attacks on Judeo-Christian values. We're saying Merry Christmas again." Trump's invocation of this shared heritage is something that has been happening across the right. In 2014, Britain's Nigel Farage said, "My country is a Judeo-Christian country, so we've got to actually start standing up for our values." Steve Bannon, Trump's former chief strategist in the White House, frequently talks about how the Judeo-Christian West is in crisis. Marine Le Pen is fond of the term too. But while this phrase has been picked up by the far right as a way of demonizing Islam, politicians of all stripes regularly use Judeo-Christian as a signifier of a united cultural front premised on shared faith-based values and worldview. Tony Blair, the former Labour Prime Minister, talked about Judeo-Christian values. The former president of the European Union, Romano Prodi, spoke of Europe's Judeo-Christian roots and common cultural heritage. The current French president, Emmanuel Macron, has described Europe as a civilization with Judeo-Christian roots. Even former German chancellors Helmut Kohl and Angela Merkel, both from the centre-right Christian Democratic Union Party, have referred to the Judeo-Christian tradition as the foundational values system guiding the German state, which is an extraordinary claim when you think about it. The Judeo-Christian heritage spoken about politically from the post-war period onwards is not actually a thing. It isn't real, religiously or philosophically or even culturally. In religious terms, it makes no sense at all. Go back to the start of the relationship between these faiths, and the heritage here was that Christians got super uppity that Jews would not recognize Christ as the savior, and so proceeded to demonize and persecute them for it. Perhaps the religious context for that hyphen is that Christians embrace the Old Testament, the Jewish Tanakh, but for Jews, their scriptures are not a religious stepping stone. They are the final destination. If anything, the actual shared heritage historically is Judeo-Islamic. Judaism is not only about the Hebrew Bible, but about all the teachings, commentary, and interpretation around that. And much of that took place in the Middle East, including the development of the Babylonian Talmud, a core text penned in what is now Iraq. And then there was the Judeo-Islamic heritage forged during Muslim rule across the Iberian Peninsula, then known as Al-Andalus. That period of interfaith advancement began at around 711, although its duration is contested, not least because the full 700 or so years of Islamic rule in Al-Andalus before the Spanish Reconquista of 1492 was marred by episodic anti-Jewish violence. But it does not minimize events to note that, relative to the experience under Christian rule at the same time, the Islamic era was one of tolerance and stability for Jews. They were able to thrive both economically and culturally and to rise to positions of prominence. This period, most notably between the 10th and 11th centuries, was one of such rich cultural collaboration that it is considered a golden age. Working together in Arabic, Jews and Muslims forged incredible advancements in science, literature, architecture, mathematics, and music. The period produced still lauded Jewish luminaries, such as the philosopher and poet Solomon ibn Birol, and the rabbi, poet, and philosopher Yehuda Halevi. The celebrated philosopher Moses Maimonides is also a product of this age, although he was forced to flee Al-Andalus and eventually settled in Egypt after the religiously intolerant Almohad dynasty took power in 1147. However, the cultural and religious autonomy during this golden age of coexistence did mean that Al-Andalus became a center of Talmudic thought and a region of key Jewish scholarship, which developed not least because of the symbiosis between Hebrew and Arabic. During that same time frame, European Christianity was circulating hate-filled conspiracies about Jewish people while murdering Jews and Muslims alike in the Crusades. The idea of a Judeo-Christian heritage really took hold in a secular political context during the mid-20th century, as US President Dwight Eisenhower announced in 1952 that the American form of government was based on Judeo-Christian moral values. Coming immediately after the Holocaust, this was a way of bringing Jewish immigrants into the American fold with a shared inclusive identity. For Jewish communities who longed to be absorbed into American society, it held obvious appeal. As Gil Hochberg, who's an academic in the US, writes, within this new fabricated Judeo-Christian alliance, Jews who had recently been considered loathed Semitic parasites could finally become almost Christian and almost white. But while this label spread into Europe, it also became an exercise in Western rebranding. The same supposedly civilized countries that had either carried out or turned a blind eye to the Holocaust while not providing refuge to Jews trying to flee the Nazis were giving themselves a makeover while also throwing Jews a bone. It wasn't really the Jewish side of the so-called Judeo-Christian heritage that needed the label so much as the Christian Western side looking for a redemption story. Reflecting on this rebrand more generally and its effect on Jewish people, the British Jewish philosopher Brian Klug explains, in the new Europe, the one that emerged from the Second World War, our role has been inverted. We have gone from being despised foil to admired model. What has not changed, however, is that collectively we, or a constructed identity that is called Jewish, performs a function for how Europe defines itself. Plus ça change, old habits die hard. As Klug also notes, this evolving dynamic has been terrible for Palestinians, hit once by the European racism that sent Jews to Palestine in pursuit of a homeland, and then hit again by the post-war European revamp that made of Israel a staunch ally to be given impunity over its crimes against Palestinians. The hyphenated heritage was, decades after the post-war period, drafted into an attack on those excluded minorities in a clash of civilizations narrative that defined Islam as the biggest threat to Western development and values. The chief storytellers of this bigotry-infused theory were the American political scientist Samuel P. Huntington, who wrote a book on the subject, as well as US historians Daniel Pipes and Bernard Lewis. These figures hold Judeo-Christian values as a protective shield against a supposedly alien and violent Islam. And of course, the story of a civilizational clash has been embraced by the far right because it offers up, on a plate with a cherry on top, a means of attacking and scapegoating Muslim communities. But at this point, it is impossible to refrain from reminding these Islam-bashing authors, commentators, and politicians which religion historically persecuted Jewish people across Europe. As Jill Jacobs, an American rabbi and director of Tru'ah, a rabbinic human rights organization, posted on Twitter/X years ago, number one, much of Judeo-Christian tradition involves centuries of Christians trying to kill us. And number two, if you mean not Muslim, just say it. That second point about excluding and then demonizing Muslims seems the main purpose of this hyphenated value system as it is used by the far right today. I could keep reading, but I don't want to do that when we could have a conversation instead. So I would welcome any questions that any of you might have or any conversation starters.
Yeah, hi. Yeah, first of all, I just want to say thank you for writing the book. I've got a copy of it, so I'm looking forward to reading it. I think my question is anti-Semitism is real, and we have to challenge it in all of its forms. But at the same time, we do have political organizations kind of using anti-Semitism to kind of challenge pro-Palestinian activists. And I say this because I'm a Muslim, but I got targeted by these political organizations because I held an anti-Semitism awareness session with Jewish socialists, and that got me kind of on their radar. So how can, what advice would you give to someone who wants to challenge anti-Semitism, but at the same time also knows that they will be targeted by these political organizations and obviously has to do something about that as well at the same time?
Yeah.
What would you say?
It's a really difficult one because it has become, and we've seen it really exaggerated in the last 15 months, with the Gaza war especially. That dynamic is very effective and has had a chilling effect on free speech. And so what I talk about in the book is that we see a dynamic emerging from the progressive left where, you know, because it's so ubiquitous, this silencing of people who want to speak in criticism of Israel, because it's so ubiquitous and because it is so damaging in its consequences, in the sense that it affects people's jobs. Like, people are losing jobs, people are losing livelihoods, they're having reputations trashed, they're having contracts cancelled. And so, because it does have these devastating consequences and is so ubiquitous, quite often the progressive response, as it needs to be, is to challenge that and to be engaged in the work of fighting back against that and refuting those fake claims. But that in itself then becomes the only thing we do. And so one of the things that I see as a dynamic emerging is that, you know, it's mostly the right wing that's talking about what they claim to be solutions to anti-Semitism, which I actually don't think are real at all. I think it's a performative claim to fight against anti-Semitism. But the reality is that it's the right wing that's talking about solutions, and all their solutions are horrible, right? All their solutions are clamping down on free speech about Palestine, demonizing Muslims, more security, more shutdown of marches. All their solutions are awful. but they have solutions. And I think one of the things that's challenging for the progressive left is to start to talk about, well, what do we see as our solutions? You know, how do we integrate the struggle against anti-Semitism into a wider anti-racist struggle that also includes a racist struggle, anti-racist struggle that also includes standing up for Palestinian rights? And I think that's a conversation that maybe needs to happen more collectively and with more volume. I also think there's one of the great things about writing this book is that it put me in contact with a lot of people who are doing this work. And they're not getting the limelight because they're not in the mainstream, but there's all kinds of organizations and individuals that are trying to find ways to raise awareness of anti-Semitism without curtailing anybody's free speech and have credibility in that sphere. Diaspora Alliance, the Jerusalem Declaration on Anti-Semitism is like a challenge to all the definitions that curtail free speech on Israel, but gives, you know, very good examples of what constitutes anti-Semitism. Jews for Racial and Economic Justice have put out work on this in the US. Letaken is a group in the UK doing that work. The Birkbeck Institute for the Study of Anti-Semitism. So there's all these organizations that I think have credibility in this sphere and are trying to build that cohesive anti-racism that means we can challenge anti-Semitism but also stand up for Palestinian rights. So hopefully that was a useful...
Yeah,
Thanks for the question, though. It's a really important one.
Thank you very much, Rachel, for that. I take your point that this rebranding of the Abrahamic faith into Judeo-Christian by people like Bernard Lewis and these people has been instrumental, and this has been going on for quite a number of years. But do you think that quoting the far right to do their battle is then a possibility that the far right may again turn against the Jewish people?
Wow. Yes. Well, they already are. And this is something that I talk about a lot. And so the book has a couple of chapters about the left and the sort of things that we could do to reconnect our anti-racist struggle. And there's 2 chapters about the way we talk about Israel-Palestine, and there's 2 chapters on the far right, because there's various iterations of the far right that are currently openly and violently anti-Semitic. So first of all, we've got great replacement theorists. Some of you may or may not have seen Elon Musk essentially endorse a great replacement theorist online, but that apparently is okay. Great replacement theory is the idea that a nefarious group of people is plotting to overwhelm white majority Western nations with mostly Muslim migrants, and because it's a conspiracy about power, the nefarious plotters are more often than not Jewish people. And so this is essentially the perfect racism cocktail for the far right, because they get to mainline all their current obsessions, which are hating Muslims and migrants, but also they get the animating, like the yeast that makes the whole thing rise, is the anti-Semitism that's like a core element of their racism. And that is mobilizing rapidly globally, and that has violent consequences. We've seen people motivated by great replacement theory involved in deadly attacks. Pittsburgh Synagogue in the US was one, also Christchurch Mosque in New Zealand. There was a Hispanic shopping center in the States, as well as a majority black neighborhood in Buffalo that also had deadly shootings that were motivated by this and cited it. I mean, the demonization of Soros, I'm really glad you mentioned that, because part of the problem we have here is that there's such a naked hypocrisy, which is that, you know, you can be as anti-Semitic as you like if you're pro-Israel. And so the demonization of George Soros that we saw, where Viktor Orban, who's the far-right Hungarian leader who ran a nakedly anti-Semitic campaign in Hungary using this invocation of George Soros, the billionaire Jewish philanthropist, in openly anti-Semitic campaign. Hungary's own Jewish community was shocked and shaken by that. But, you know, he's great friends with the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, and therefore is exempt from criticism, seemingly. And so part of the problem that we have here is that there's this, the way that the media and political conversation is being held is that it's creating the impression that there's more anti-Semitism coming from campus protests about Gaza than there are coming from the far right, including the pro-Israel far right. And that in itself is muddying the waters and also dividing us, right? It's dividing anti-racist movements and making it hard for us to fight these different elements of racism collectively rather than siloed into different groups. So I'm really glad you mentioned George Soros, because key figure there.
Shalom Aleichem. I was going to ask, where do you see the trajectory of historically between how Judaism has sort of conflated with the founding of Israel and Zionism, and it's becoming sort of like not conflating anymore, it's almost fusing now. So within your personal experience with other Jews in Britain, because there seems to be like border British deputies and things, they tie in the Judaism so closely with a nation state, which I would feel is crazy for me, for example. Like, I would criticize Saudi Arabia or Iran or Pakistan, which are predominantly Muslim nations. I have no problem doing that, but that wouldn't, or any person in the world criticize other nation states. It wouldn't be a criticism of Muslims or Islam. It's a criticism of a nation state. So how do Jews in the UK, because it seems to be more of them, are fusing their identity with a nation state rather than to the Torah?
Yeah, that is, it's an excellent question, because it really gets to the heart of some of the complexities here. And it's also a really difficult question to answer, because I think it's very difficult for people who are not Jewish to untangle the quite messy relationship or attachment that exists. I think that I was not raised in this way, but many Jews are raised in this way, whereby, you know, in the diaspora, like in the UK and the US, whereby attachment to Israel is actually so deeply entwined with Jewish identity that it becomes interchangeable. And that's, you know, you can say that that's partly because of, you know, being brought up in that way to see the two as entwined. But I think people have many different reasons for that attachment of the idea of there being a Jewish state, not necessarily one that is, you know, a violent ethno-nationalist state, but the idea that this place exists. The origin story, which is, you know, for Jewish people, for many Jewish people, again, it's like a response to rampant European anti-Semitism and an escape from that. Of course, the problem is, or the issue here is that we have two histories. Like, the history for Jewish people is of Israel as a national project. The history for Palestinian people is of Israel as a settler colonial project. And the two are parallel and true narratives, right? But I think that's the issue that arises, and that's the conversations that we now need to engage with, whereby I'm sure that if you were raised in an environment where attachment to Israel is an intrinsic part of your Jewish identity, then attacks on Israel are going to feel like an attack on your identity. That doesn't mean that's true, you know, and I think it's okay to challenge that and have a conversation about that, not least because, as we say, there's another group of people in this conversation, Palestinians, who also need to be able to define their experience of racism because of the Israeli state. And so, you know, I think that's the trouble, that all of these things are true all at the same time, and we're now required to, like, do the work of untangling all that in a way that builds solidarity, but we're doing it in the middle of this scrappy bun fight where everyone's yelling at each other and people are trying to silence voices on a march that are basically just crying out for the slaughter in Gaza to stop, right? And so it's a lot of work for us to do. What I would say, though, is that that picture is changing. So when you look in the UK, it has been fragmenting for some time, the British Jewish community, over the issue of support for Israel, but also this particular definition of anti-Semitism. But the last 15 months have really polarized. And so you see like a big political constituency now, maybe 30%, who do not adhere to that view, and that figure is way higher in the younger population. It's up to 50% in 18 to 29-year-olds. So I do think that pattern is changing. Diaspora Jews who think differently are no longer like a marginal group. They're actually a political constituency. That's going to have an impact on the conversation as well, for the better, I think. Not sure if I answered that question, but obviously there's a lot going on in that.
I worked ages ago, 20-odd years ago, in an Israeli company based here in the UK, and it was quite funny because all the Israelis were sort of like working here in the UK as their ticket out of Israel, because, I mean, all these various people that I knew, Israelis, were thinking, well, I don't want to raise my kids in a society, and this was back in 2000, before Ariel Sharon went on the Temple Mount, and they were saying, well, I don't really, the country's going, for once, they felt it was just going too far right, too sort of fascist, and these were Israelis. So I think a couple of them I know now have gone to America now, and I would have thought, and for example, my brother works as an academic, so he collaborated with Israeli academics, but then they were thinking, oh, I got to go, I got to leave. They were like here in the UK, and then, but they also think, well, I should be back in Israel as a constituency to push back on the far right in Israel, which is it's like almost a fait accompli in Israel. So you're thinking, oh gosh, can Israel just come back from that? And so I remember hearing Ami Ayalon, the ex-head of Shin Bet. He recently came in November to JW3, you know, Yachad, and he was almost petitioning British Jews to somehow put pressure on Israel to, like, we've got to pull it back, because this is almost like it's like some kind of frenzy going on, because it's not about any animus whatsoever towards Judaism, Jews, or it's just, you know, it's don't do the slaughter, and just have an equitable justice for everyone. Doesn't matter what religion or whatever. But
I mean, you raised something really interesting, which is, I mean, I think that's the reason why we're seeing that, exactly what you describe is the reason we're seeing that fragmentation with the Jewish community, and particularly among younger demographics, because they want their own identity to be coherent, morally congruent with their other values, which include, you know, anti-racism and include Palestine solidarity. And so it's just like, it doesn't fit, right? And so that's why it's fragmenting. But I think what you remind me of is a really interesting point, which is actually for Israel, the reality is that they're much more interested in, because they see this decline in support amongst Jews outside of Israel in the way that you've described, they're much more interested in the constituency of Christian Zionists. I mean, there's just more of them, right? There's 80 to 100 million Christian Zionists in the US alone. And Ron Dermer, who is now in the far-right Israeli government, but was then, I think, ambassador to America, was actually said this out loud in an interview. He was like, well, you know, there's only a tiny percentage of Jews in America, but there's like, whatever, 20%. I don't know if you got the stats right. It was like more of them are Christian evangelists. And when you start to listen to Benjamin Netanyahu's speeches with that filter on, you start to realize how often he's talking to Christian Zionists. You know, the language he's using. He quite often says, we have no greater friends than you. Just as a constituency, their political influence, their financial influence in terms of funding some horrific settlements projects, especially in East Jerusalem. It's just more sizable and becomes more and more significant the more you see diaspora Jewry sort of break away from that relationship with Israel. So you just reminded me of that. Thank you.
Rachel, sorry.
Hello.
Hi there. Hello, Rachel. Thank you very much for a very interesting speech and conversation. I think is interesting because Seth Rogen, who's a Jewish American comedian actor, said something funny, but also very true and very interesting, which is the whole narrative of the Christian evangelical movement in the US is to essentially deport all the Jews to Israel, so that it can precipitate, you know, obviously the end of Jewry and then the reappearance. Do you think, I mean, I know it's a little bit forward thinking, but do you think that this almost messianic cult-like Christian evangelical movement will untangle at some point? Because there needs to be a timeline. Most cults and tend to, I mean, it's not, the movement isn't that old. I mean, it's maybe under 200 years old. So do you believe that maybe they'll have a cut-off point more? Well, it hasn't happened. There are that many Jews that have now gone back from Boston and what have you and booted the Palestinians out, and Christ hasn't reappeared and butchered them all.
That's such a great question. Sorry,
it baffles me.
There's a chapter in my book where I look at Christian Zionists because, I mean, what even? So for people who maybe are not familiar, the whole concept is exactly as you say. The whole concept is we must, for Christian evangelists, we must support Israel because, like, they rely on some phrase in the Bible that says God will bless those who bless Israel and God will curse those who... And so they rely on this to mean, well, we have to fully support Israel so that we get rewarded by God. But the other element is that they think that if every Jewish person is in Israel, then that heralds the second coming and that heralds Armageddon, in which every Jewish person who is already in Israel in the world either converts or dies, right? And so This is why some experts on the issue have described Christian Zionists as like the biggest anti-Semitic organization globally. But the interesting thing about them is, I mean, there's many bizarre and interesting things about them, but it's like, it's self-fulfilling. So they see signs everywhere, right? So 1967 was a big sign, right? The fact that Israel managed to occupy Palestinian East Jerusalem, the West Bank, Gaza, and Syrian Golan Heights was a sign. It must mean that the second coming is getting nearer, right? The fact that Donald Trump moved the American embassy to Jerusalem in a terrible move that, you know, set the region on fire and resulted in dozens of deaths in Gaza alone, that was a sign. It's like everything is a sign that the second coming is coming closer. Gaza war, again, a sign. So the fact that they can continue to see signs, I think, is they view that as more significant than actually sort of counting numbers of, wait, how many Jewish people are actually in Israel yet? Have we got enough? It's more like they keep seeing signs of the prophecy coming true, which you will discover if you ever like decide one rainy afternoon to listen to one of, you know, John Hagee, the Christian evangelist's very long sermons, for instance, where he talks about all these prophecies.
Thank you, Rachel. My follow-up question to that is the narrative is convoluted on both sides, and I think this is actually missed by a lot of commentators. I want to say something semi-controversial here, but I feel quite safe within these walls to say it, which is on the Muslim side, the narrative around Al-Quds, specifically the Temple Mount on the Al-Aqsa, as it's known by its Muslim name, the vast majority of Muslims will refer to this as the ascension point for the Prophet on his, the Holy Prophet, peace be upon him, on his miraculous night journey. Now there's some debate as to actually whether that particular mosque was actually that departure point referred to in the Holy Quran. Obviously a big part of the narrative is, you know, for Muslims, is that you know, represents the essentially third holiest site for Islam. I have my own view, which I've just, you know, expanded upon regarding that, but I think the point there is that it's also convoluted on both sides, because there's a fair body of research from Jewish professors that wasn't the Wailing Wall wasn't even the remains of the original temple built by the Prophet Solomon. So it's been politicized and convoluted on both sides. And religion's been weaponized. That's what's actually happened. In my view, certainly.
I think it's certainly the messianic religious element. I think we can see ways in which that shows up across the three Abrahamic faiths in iterations in Israel-Palestine. However, I don't think that this is a religious conflict. I think this is it's a struggle for freedom and freedom from occupation and, you know, the right to live in peace and dignity and equality on your own land, right? So I do feel like the whole, we do see them, and, you know, the Christian Zionists have found, in a way, sort of perfect political alliance with the Jewish messianic settlers. You know, they're of a piece in many ways, but I don't think, you know, I think that can take us away from what the real struggle is, you know, which is a struggle for freedom from occupation and apartheid rule and, now a genocidal war. So I think, it's important to keep hold of that. And, I find that a lot with, the sort of Western appraisal of this, ancient, intractable conflict of ancient religious hatred. And you're like, what now? That's not that's not what this is. It's a political conflict. It's not an ancient religious thing. So I do think it's important to keep that focus on the political struggle of it.
Thank you very much again for the excellent talk. My question was kind of on the political landscape in Israel. I mean, over the past 20, 30 years, we have seen the rise of the right and the extreme right in Israel. And correct me if I'm wrong, I think prior to this, most governments were more centrist, liberal, even social democratic. I don't know. Do you think the rise of the extreme right is kind of, are there the same reasons as we see here in the Western democracies, where we, again, US, UK, Germany, France, where we see the rise of the right, or are there some specific reasons or components which kind of are applicable to Israel itself? Or is it part of the general rise of the far right in the Western capitalist world?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's something I think about a lot. I suspect it's a bit of both. So I think obviously the far right is having a moment. Like it's their world now in the way that, they've got power in so many parts of the world. And Israel is of a piece with that. Israel is on that set. In fact, look, Benjamin Netanyahu wrote the playbook for being an authoritarian. It's a toss-up between him and Turkey's Tayyip Erdogan as to who was the first of the block in creating this authoritarian playbook. And so it is of a piece with the rise of the authoritarian far right that we see from, Jair Bolsonaro to Viktor Orban to Donald Trump to, Benjamin Netanyahu. It's all of a piece, and it is a political resurgence for sure. And it has this sort of ethno-nationalist nativism at its core, right? That's one of its guiding principles. So it's no great surprise that the far right, loves the idea of Israel as an ethno-nationalist state, right? And at the same time, I do think, there's something about the trajectory of Israel politically where, this constant impunity, this constant ability to flout and violate international law with zero consequences. And I'm not setting that up as some kind of why does Israel get away with it? Obviously, because it's geopolitically important as an asset for, its Western allies. It's as simple as that. It's not, the tail is not wagging the dog. That we have Western allies who perceive a geopolitical interest in Israel as a foothold in the Middle East, as the oil, the military assets, the security sharing, the intel sharing, all of it. Is considered to be strategically useful. But there's something about that trajectory where if you constantly have that impunity, and if you constantly reject the idea of a Palestinian state or any kind of, whatever, it doesn't matter whatever configuration that is, the main thing is that people, both Israeli Jews and Palestinians, are living with equity and justice and freedom in that region. If you're constantly rejecting that and you're constantly flouting international law, then that creates its own momentum and its own trajectory where you are just going to end up more and more extreme, right? So I think there's an element of that in the mix as well. So like maybe one is overlapping with the other. Maybe the domestic is overlapping with the international to produce the outcome we see today.
Thank you very much, Rachel. I'm just wondering what your thoughts are around the second tenure of Trump. If we look at what happened during his first term, the growth of nationalism, the growth of countries just looking, if you like, the authority that the presence of Trump gave everybody to dare to do what was in their head, but were not able to express. And particularly his release of the people who did the uprising in the US Parliament. Will that create more expansion and more trouble, and particularly with his views around selling arms to any country, anyhow, let them kill themselves, it's not my business. So how do you see that playing out in the case of the current case of Israel, Palestine, particularly now that even the ceasefire, just in the last 48 hours, has some strings around, we didn't understand it this way, we didn't understand it this way. There's already tension around that. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I'm really glad you asked that question. It's very pertinent. I think that thing that you said about, you know, whatever's in your head, like just unleash the worst instincts about people. We are going to see a rise in racial hate, and I think to me that speaks to the importance of fighting racism collectively rather than in silos. Like we're not going to be able to deal with it in sort of separate silos. We can only, and it's going to be across the spectrum of racisms. You know, we're going to see the white nationalists, great replacement theory, Islamophobia, anti-black racism, all of it, everything all at once. So I think we have to fight everything all at once together. With Israel-Palestine, I mean, the reality is that Joe Biden could have done what Trump did at any point in those 15 months and didn't. And, you know, we can call that thug politics. We can call that, you know, Netanyahu sending his guy to talk to Netanyahu and saying, which apparently he did, I don't care that it's Shabbat, I'm talking to you, and we're not leaving this room until it's done. Biden could have done that at any moment in the last 15 months, and that's on him. Right? I don't think that speaks to a particular Trump capacity for calling for a ceasefire. I think that speaks instead to the profound failure of Joe Biden to do anything about it for 15 months. It speaks much more about that. And in terms of Israel-Palestine, we can see what he's already talking about, ethnic cleansing for Gaza. The people he's appointed in his cabinet, in his government, are very... you know, don't think that Palestinians are a thing, are very big advocates of Christian evangelism. I think we're going to see that get much worse. I worry about what's going to happen, particularly in East Jerusalem and the occupied West Bank, in terms of the Jewish settler expansionism and violence that will be supported by Christian evangelism. And at the same time, you know, I do think while all of this is going on, we're dealing in a reality where, you know, there just is more global awareness because the last 50 months, you know, a lot of people who may not have had their eye on this story have kind of thought, wait a minute, what's going on in Gaza? Hang on a minute, what, there's a siege? It's been besieged for 16 months? Oh, if the Gaza population are mostly refugees, well, then where did they come from, right? So people are asking all these questions because of being exposed to what's been happening over the last 15 months. And I think that you can't put that back in the bottle. I don't think you can put back in the bottle people's awareness, like a grassroots awareness of what's been happening. And so you know, that's going to have create its own momentum and its own force in the face of Trumpism as well, which I guess is where we have to find some hope.
Thank you very much, Rachel. Unfortunately, that's all we have time for, but I'm sure Rachel will be around for some time afterwards. If you have questions you want to ask her, please let's thank her again with a round of applause.
Thank you so much for inviting me to be here today.
Thank you. Today, Fatiha has been provided in memory of Marhum Hussein Ali Asaria on his death anniversary. Please recite a Surah Fatiha for him. This Sunday we have a program celebrating the wiladat of Imam Hussein, Imam Zainul Abidin and Hazrat Abbas. The program starts at 5:03 with Salah, followed by Quran, a Qasida, the main talk by Sheikh Ayyub Rashid, and ending with dinner. We hope you can join us for the celebration. Next week's Salam talk will be by Farzana Karawali Hirji to discuss an unspoken reality, the epidemic of mental health challenges in our communities. We hope you can join us once again at 8 p.m. On Saturday, 22nd February, Sikkim will be hosting a trip. On Saturday, 22nd February, Sikkim will be hosting a trip to see the new West End play, A Knock on the Roof, a powerful play about survival and everyday life in Gaza. Tickets are £23. To find out more and book tickets, visit sikkim.org.uk/A Knock on the Roof. Our Ramadan program has also now been published. To learn more, visit sikkim.org.uk/Ramadan. We also have regular activities throughout the week, including Mums and Tots and Ladies Pilates on Mondays, yoga and ladies exercise classes on Tuesdays, karate and taekwondo on Wednesdays, dua kumel and hifz classes on Thursdays, a salam talk on Fridays, the Women's Walking Club and tuition on Saturdays, and madrasa, soul kitchen and tafsir classes on Sundays. Please do join us. Salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad.